It all began with a single phone call. It was brief, menacing, and impossible to trace. But for the woman who answered, it was the start of a nightmare that would spiral into one of the most baffling and disturbing mysteries in Canadian history. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Things were going pretty well for Cindy James in the fall of 1982, and it had been a long time coming. Her life to that point could have been described as average by most people. She grew up in a military family that moved around a bit, graduated high school, and eventually decided to get into nursing as a career. But there were some darker moments throughout her life to that point too. She was born on June 12, 1944 in Oliver, British Columbia, Canada as one of 6 children. Her father, Otto, was in the Canadian Air Force, and as a military man, Cindy would often write in her diary about how strict he was and how he would use corporal punishment whenever he deemed it appropriate. At some point while the family was living in Ottawa, Otto got another transfer, this time back to France, but Cindy wouldn't be joining them there. Instead, she was heading back to British Columbia to attend nursing school. During the holidays and breaks afterward from her studies, she would fly out to France to visit them, but most often she kept in touch through letters. In these letters, Cindy would update the family on how school was going and what she was up to in general, but after a while, she started to make mention of a male intern that she met. Then, not long after he started to appear in the letters, she announced that the two were engaged to be married. Tragically, however, a letter would soon come to explain that the intern had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and while the couple was on a skiing vacation together, he decided to end things himself. Interestingly, never in her letters did she ever name him, and none of her family members ever met him, prompting some speculation among her loved ones that the story was never true and just a figment of Cindy's imagination or possibly even a lie. In any case, 3 years later, she met a South African doctor named Roy Makepeace, and although he was 18 years older than her, the two began a relationship and eventually got married. Cindy was much more forthcoming about Roy and was able to show that he did actually exist, but Otto was concerned about the marriage. He felt like his daughter was exhibiting gullibility that Roy was taking advantage of, and while there was never any real evidence that the doctor was in it for anything but his love for Cindy, the relationship was anything but storybook. Soon enough, in Cindy's letters to France, she started to write that the couple was emotionally distant, and not only that, but she later claimed that Roy was physical with her on several occasions. Meanwhile, after working as a pediatric nurse at Vancouver General Hospital for a time, Cindy got a new job as a team coordinator at the Blenheim House, which was a facility for children with behavioral issues. All the while, the relationship between Cindy and Roy continued to disintegrate. Finally, during the summer of 1982, it became all too much and they decided to amicably separate. But thankfully afterwards, Cindy enjoyed her newfound freedom and she was especially in love with her new job. For the first 4 months after the separation, things couldn't have gone any better for her, but all of that changed when the phone rang at her house on October 7th, 1982. When she picked up and said hello, the voice on the other end spoke in a hushed tone before the caller abruptly hung up. This was an odd phone call. Cindy initially thought that maybe it was just a wrong number or a bad connection, but this would not be the last time she heard this voice. This October 7th call kicked off a series of harassing, obscene, and threatening calls that would last for the next 7 years. In the early stages of this period, Cindy reported the calls to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who sent an officer to her house to investigate. By this point, she had only received a few of the disturbing calls, so the officer recommended that she start to keep a log of when the calls come in and the content of the conversations. Additionally, he told her that getting an unlisted phone number would be a good idea. So, satisfied that the matter had been settled, the officer left and told her to call back if the unwanted calls continued or if she noticed anything else abnormal. But just seconds after he departed, Cindy's phone rang with no one on the other end. And disturbingly, the very next day, the voice returned and even mentioned the police visit to her home. As the days passed, things began to escalate quickly, and Cindy was no longer tormented by just a few phone calls. A little more than a week after the first call came in, she spotted an intruder creeping around the outside of her house, and the next morning she discovered her porch lights had been shattered. At another point, a rock was thrown through one of her windows and someone broke in, but when she investigated, everything in the house appeared to be as it should. On October 19th, however, someone entered the house again and slashed one of the pillows sitting on her bed. And every time one of these incidents would occur, Cindy called the police as she was instructed. Considering how the suspicious activity was ramping up, police started to look into what was going on a lot more closely. In interviews with Cindy, they learned about her past relationships, including the recent separation she had gone through with Roy. And right away, he became a prime suspect, but they weren't expecting her to tell them that she didn't think that he was capable of such torment. Yes, he had been violent with her in the past, and the police knew that. He even admitted as much, but stalking and violently harassing her didn't seem to be in his character. This wasn't enough for the police to take their eye off him completely, but they began to consider other possibilities as well. Maybe she had some sort of twisted admirer from her work or the neighborhood, or maybe someone close to her knowing that she was now on her own was behind the incidents. Basically, anything was on the table, but they were no closer to identifying whoever it was. Meanwhile, the phone calls and strange activity continued, and by then others were starting to take note too. Cindy had taken on tenants to live in her basement apartment, and the two people who lived there noted on October 20th that they heard strange noises above them. When they went to investigate, they discovered that the rest of the house was empty and that Cindy was likely at work, as expected for that time of the day. When Cindy came home and heard about this from her tenant, she called the police, who sent out a constable named Patrick. He then interviewed the tenants before going to Cindy's neighbors to see if they'd noticed anything, and one of them would tell Patrick that they had seen a man outside Cindy's house multiple times. This might have been the break police had been looking for, but when asked if the man happened to look like Cindy's estranged husband, Roy, the neighbor said it looked nothing like him. Now, other than the creepiness going on, Patrick being dispatched to investigate the incident seemed almost to be like fate. When they met, there was just something between Patrick and Cindy, and what started as an interview quickly turned into casual dating and more. In fact, within a few days of meeting, Patrick, who was also separated from his spouse, moved in with Cindy. So not only did Cindy now have someone to support her through all the turmoil that was engulfing her life, she had someone who could protect her should things escalate any further. And only a few days after moving in, Patrick was taking some empty boxes out to the trash when he noticed a car sitting in the alleyway behind Cindy's house with a man inside it. When he approached the vehicle, the driver's identity became clear. It was Roy. Patrick immediately started grilling Cindy's estranged husband, who claimed that he was staking out the house to see if he could spot whoever was responsible for harassing Cindy. Patrick then went on to inform him that he had moved in with Cindy, so Roy, obviously upset by this revelation, quickly drove off. In the weeks afterward, during his time living at the house, Patrick experienced one of the phone calls that Cindy was receiving, only the person who made the call never spoke. Police made every effort to trace these calls that kept coming in, but they were usually far too short for them to get a location on them. And as the perpetrator continued to prove, however, the phone calls were the least of Patrick and Cindy's worries. In late November, Cindy came out to her car to leave for work, but just as she was getting in, she noticed there was a photograph that was pinned beneath one of her windshield wipers. When she went around the car to see what it was, the breath was knocked out of her. It was a picture of a dead body beneath a medical sheet. And then, later that same day, Patrick investigated outside the house and found that the phone lines had been cut in 5 separate places. While all of this was going on, Cindy and Roy actually seemed to remain on good terms despite their separation. And in fact, as unlikely as it might have been, Patrick and Roy started to form a friendship because the ex-couple remained in contact. Cindy would even invite her estranged husband over to the house for dinner, and the three would sit there and discuss the case. It seemed as though Roy was genuinely interested in helping Cindy solve whatever was going on. A couple of months would go by like this, and Patrick would eventually move back to his place on December 1st, but he and Cindy would continue dating. With Christmas fast approaching, Cindy was looking forward to having a quiet holiday season, but these hopes were crushed when she found a note outside her house with another photograph. On it, the message just said, "Merry Christmas," but the image was grotesque. It was of a woman who was clearly deceased due to a long wound along her neck. This barrage of harassment was constant through phone calls, notes, and reports of a man outside the home all the way until the end of the year, but for the most part, things didn't escalate any further. This would all change at the end of January to kick off 1983. On the night of the 27th, Cindy's good friends Tom and Agnes dropped by the house unexpectedly. When they knocked on the door, they received no answer, and although Cindy's car was parked in the driveway, it wasn't terribly odd for her to not come to the door around this time. Agnes knew that one of Cindy's favorite parts of the day was taking a relaxing bath, so she figured that's where she was. Just as they were about to leave, however, Agnes thought she heard something coming from behind the house. She and Tom then went to check it out, and when they reached the detached garage area, there was Cindy crouched down and cowering in fear with a black nylon stocking tied tightly around her neck. Tom and Agnes then quickly moved to untie the stocking as Cindy gasped for air. When she finally caught her breath, she started to explain what happened. She said she'd gone up to the garage to get some boxes, but suddenly she was grabbed from behind. The person then led her into the garage where another man was waiting. The two men then took turns wrapping the nylon around her before one of them assaulted her with a knife. Tom then rushed inside the house to call the authorities, and shortly after they arrived, Cindy was whisked away to the nearby hospital by ambulance. She was then examined and thankfully found to be in good condition despite the attack. Strangely though, doctors saw no signs of the knife assault Cindy described. So despite the evidence of Cindy being victimized by an unknown and clearly obsessed assailant, police started to wonder about a new potential suspect, which was Cindy herself. They were making no headway in their investigation otherwise, so again, everything was on the table. This was a scenario that didn't seem to make much sense though, and it certainly didn't align with what had been reported to that point. It wasn't like Cindy was the only one to witness these things. Neighbors had reported sightings outside the house, the tenants had heard strange noises above them when Cindy was at work, and even one of their own, Patrick, had answered one of the strange phone calls that Cindy was receiving. Still, investigators felt the need to cover all their bases, so they recommended Cindy speak to a psychiatrist, but she refused, fearing that it would stigmatize her in the eyes of police and those close to her. As 1983 wore on, the calls still came in and notes randomly arrived at the home. Cindy even moved twice in the first half of the year, but the harassment only followed her as if the perpetrator was watching her the whole time. And feeling like she had been betrayed by the police, she hired a private investigator named Ozzy who acted like a neutral third party as he got himself caught up on the case. In speaking to police and reviewing reports, he came to believe that Cindy wasn't being nearly as forthcoming as she should be with investigators, almost as if she was hiding something. And now that he was working the case for Cindy, it was something he could keep a close eye on. More than a year after the very first phone call came in, things progressed in terrible ways. In late 1983, 3 cats were found dead and bound with rope in her garden. In response, and in case she needed him immediately, Ozzy gave Cindy a two-way radio, and one night he heard strange noises coming from Cindy's side of it. When he arrived at the house, he knocked on the door, but Cindy didn't answer. He then stepped to the window on the porch and peered inside and found her lying on the floor as if she was dead. Ozzy then immediately kicked in the door and checked Cindy's vital signs. She was still breathing and still had a pulse, but most concerning was that a paring knife had been driven through her hand with a note attached to it. In letters that were cut from a magazine were the words, "Now you must die." Once again, Cindy was rushed to the hospital where she would make a full recovery, and when she was stable, she told Ozzy that all she remembered was seeing a man she didn't recognize enter the front gate before she was hit over the head with a blunt object. She also reported the feeling of a needle going into her arm, and when doctors looked her over, sure enough, there was a puncture wound. Weirdly though, a toxicology report determined that there were no drugs in her system. Police, who were still exploring every possible angle of the case, urged Cindy to take a polygraph test, which she initially agreed to. Initially, there was no deception detected, meaning Cindy was telling the truth according to the test, but the officer who administered it would later say after further examination that the results were inconclusive. And meanwhile, it seemed that there was no end in sight to Cindy's torment. On June 18, 1984, Ozzy received a frantic call from her, and when he arrived at her house in a rush, he found Cindy in the garden, absolutely panic-stricken. She claimed someone had broken in and she managed to escape, but she didn't know if the potential attacker was still inside. Ozzy then entered the house to investigate, and when he went into the basement, he found Cindy's dog Heidi had been bound up with rope. And then next to Heidi was also a note that read "Happy Birthday," accompanied by several explicit photos. On the windowsill of the basement, Ozzy also found a cigarette butt, and while Cindy was a smoker, she didn't smoke that particular brand. This incident, more than anything, convinced Ozzy that Cindy was not the person behind all of this. More than a year later, Cindy was attacked again, this time at a nearby park while walking Heidi around 8:30 in the evening. Later that same night, Cindy was clearly under the influence of something as she frantically tried to enter the home of a neighbor, thinking that it was her own house. She was taken to the hospital, where once again, 2 needle puncture marks were found in her arm. While there as well, the hospital receptionist received a strange phone call from someone who spoke with an accent of some kind. The man on the line then began to ask the receptionist questions about the hospital's security staff and protocol. And sometime later, police played a recording of Roy's voice to see if she recognized it as the man who called that night, and she told them that it sounded like the same man. Another little while later, things took an even stranger turn in the summer of 1985 when Cindy had to be involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward after attempting to end things. This gave police more of a reason to doubt everything she reported to that point. Then, in a separate incident as 1985 came to a close, motorists in Vancouver spotted something in the ditch around 6 p.m. one night in December. It was Cindy. She was discovered badly beaten with cuts and bruises all over her body and a black nylon stocking tied around her neck. And also similar to other attacks, Cindy had needle puncture wounds in her arm, leading police to believe that she had been injected with a tranquilizer. After she was taken to the hospital and recovered, Cindy had no memory of how she ended up in the ditch. Another couple of months later, in early 1986, in response to everything going on, Tom and Agnes start to spend nights at her place. On one occasion, Cindy woke the couple up in the middle of the night after hearing a loud noise downstairs. Tom, however, was already awake because he heard it too. Then when they went to investigate, they found that Cindy's basement was in flames. Agnes then ran to the phone, but the line had also been cut, so Tom ran out the front door to see if he could get a neighbor to call the fire department. And when he did, he saw a man standing outside the house. Unfortunately though, as Tom approached him, the man ran off. Incredibly, despite the fact that there were 2 other witnesses to what happened that night, police believe Cindy staged the entire thing. There were no signs of forced entry, yet the fire had undoubtedly started inside the house. When they checked the accessible windows as well, investigators also found that none of the dust on any of them had been disturbed, making it unlikely that someone climbed through them. All of this was just very confusing. Either way, in the days that followed the fire, Cindy stayed at the home of Tom and Agnes, and they found it strange that she refused to eat and would sometimes remark that her life wasn't worth living anymore. Cindy was also being treated by a psychiatrist, and around this same time, he had seen and heard enough from her to believe that she needed more specialized treatment. She was then placed in a psych ward of a local hospital where she received a comprehensive evaluation over a 10-week stay. Unfortunately though, this didn't change anything. Cindy would continue to file police report after police report through 1987 and much of 1988. Then, on October 11th, 1988, Roy's home answering machine recorded 2 strange messages, one of which was a strongly worded threat on Cindy's life. Then, about 2 weeks later, Cindy was attacked again. When she was discovered unconscious inside her garage with a black nylon stocking around her neck, only this time she was hogtied. In investigating this incident, police sought the assistance of a not expert to examine the way Cindy was tied. More than anything though, they wanted to determine if it was possible that she could have tied herself that way. But when the expert analyzed the knots and the photos of how Cindy was bound, he said there was little way she could have done it herself. Several months later, on June 8, 1989, a truck pulled up to the curb of an abandoned house in the Richmond neighborhood of Vancouver and parked. A municipal worker then got out and started to get his tools together when he noticed a fuel tank on the property had been spray painted in bright orange paint. Graffiti wasn't exactly uncommon to come across in his line of work, but what he thought he could read of it from the street was. As he got closer, what he spotted in the street was confirmed. It was a vulgar message, but let's just say it was the equivalent of "someone died here." He then continued toward the tank and noticed there was also spray paint on the ground in a line that led from the tank to the backyard where it was connected with a large circle. In the middle of this circle was the dead and decomposing body of Cindy. She had a nylon stocking around her neck and she was hogtied, lying on her right side in the fetal position. When police and forensics responded to the scene, a pathologist's examination of the body showed that Cindy's hands had been tied so tightly together that one of her fingernails had cut the side of the finger next to it down to the bone. There was also a needle puncture wound in her arm, and an autopsy determined her death was caused by overdoses of several sedatives. One of the drugs found in her body was morphine, which was at a level 10 times greater than the legal dose. 2 other drugs were also discovered in her stomach in large quantities, and when the toxicology report came back, the coroner estimated that just with the morphine alone, Cindy would have been gone within minutes. On the surface, it appeared as clear-cut a homicide as police were ever likely to investigate, but the RCMP wasn't convinced. Considering Cindy's psychological history and the more than 100 police reports that she had filed in the previous 7 years, they believed her death was the result of another staged scene that went wrong or that she finally ended things herself. In late spring of 1990, so about a year after her body was discovered, a coroner's inquest was formed to get to not only the bottom of how Cindy died, but who was responsible. More than 80 witnesses would go on to testify, including Cindy's loved ones, police, experts, and several doctors who treated Cindy for psychological ailments. When it came time for the psychiatrists and psychologists to speak to the jury of 5 people, some interesting findings came to light. The several doctors she was under the care of had all diagnosed her differently. One said she had a condition called histrionic personality disorder, which includes symptoms like dramatic emotions and thoughts, gullibility, difficulty maintaining relationships, and behavior that is exaggerated in comparison to the situations they may find themselves in. Another determined that she was likely suffering from borderline personality disorder, and the third believed that Cindy exhibited symptoms of dissociative personality disorder, which was once known as multiple personality disorder. The person who would turn out to be the unexpected star witness, however, was a not expert who was different from the one police previously consulted with. During his testimony, he said that he believed it was possible that Cindy could have bound herself in the rope the way she was discovered before the drugs in her system had taken effect. And in front of the jury, he actually demonstrated this, and it took him just 3 minutes to bind himself. Obviously though, none of this explained the many witnesses to Cindy's harassment. From Tom to Agnes to Roy to her next door neighbors, there were more than a handful of people who testified and supported Cindy's claims that she was the target of some obsessed and depraved stalker who finally ended his 7-year-long reign of terror by ending her life. When the inquest concluded, the jury began deliberations, but just like all the forensics and psychology experts, they couldn't determine whether Cindy died as a result of homicide, accident, or by her own doing. So, tragically, in the end, Cindy's death certificate denotes that she perished as a result of an unknown event. So, what do you think happened? Do you think Cindy was a troubled individual and for one reason or another was responsible for all of the supposed incidents over the years? Or do you think the explanation is more sinister, and everything that happened to her was really done by someone else, which was worsened by the fact that she was then gaslit about what was going on? I'm curious to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Anyway, if you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.